just to summarize where we've got to on these sessions. The theme is solidarity in dangerous times as part of our Lent program in Union Chapel. And we've been looking at the Bible and how the understanding of solidarity is expressed in the biblical literature. So away from political theory, away from contemporary philosophy, looking back into the ancient world and seeing if there's anything within that which we can learn from. And I think so far we've discovered quite a lot. But we are going back into another era, another time, another mindset than our own. And that I personally think is quite helpful. So the first week we looked at the story of Cain and Abel, which is a very sort of primeval or primitive story, and a story that follows just on from the story of creation, Cain and Abel, the children of Adam and Eve, and how Cain kills Abel. So it's a negative story, negative theology. It's looking at what we ought not to be and how the world ought not to be, but bringing out of it in the end a positive affirmation that we are our brother's keeper, that even though the hostility between these two brothers is really a representation of hostility within humanity itself. We know that ultimately we are our brother's keeper. And then the second week we looked at a little passage from Hosea, but we were looking at the difference between a contractual relationship and a covenant relationship. And we looked at the idea of covenant. A contractual relationship being a kind of contemporary sort of understanding of how relationships, I will do this if you do that. We enter into a relationship, but we know that we can end it if need be, and if one person doesn't keep their side of the bargain or whatever. And a covenant relationship is one where if things go wrong, the relationship adjusts itself and adapts. But the understanding is that the covenant is an enduring relationship. It's a long relationship. It's a long-term relationship. And of course, the whole biblical story is a story of God's continuing covenant relationship, firstly with the people of Israel and then with the whole of humanity. And very intimate passage that we looked at, Hosea, out of Egypt I have called my son, and how God loves the people. And then the third session we looked at the story of Daniel in the lion's den in the book of Daniel, which is a story of set in under an authoritarian regime in the Babylonian Empire. And we saw some quite comic elements in it, compared it to Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator, how the story was written in a way to make fun of the bureaucracy of the Babylonian Empire. And then last week, you were there, like Rajan, last week, we looked at the early church, Pentecost, as a reversal of Babel, giving power to the margins, the valuing of difference, and how we moved on to look at Acts chapter 6, how when Pentecost failed and there was dispute within the early church, how they, in exactly the style of the covenant relationship, adjusted that relationship and brought in, adapted their way working to continue treating people equally. And that was in that case between the Hellenistic and the Aramaic Christians. And this week we move on to look at restoration and restitution. And the question is how to put things right. And you can probably think of other contemporary questions that cluster around those two words, restoration and restitution. But I thought of things like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, and the whole argument, that is really quite current, I think, because I just went onto the Guardian website and looking at restitution for the slavery period. On the Guardian, I think didn't read it properly, but it looks as if they've unearthed a sordid past for the Manchester Guardian and the connection between their original owner and slavery, looking at how they can put that right, just as the Church of England has made, I don't know how many millions available to compensate for the awful period of slavery. And that remains, I think, in the United States as a really hot issue. You can also think about the return of artifacts to countries where, I think the Koh-i-Noor diamond, they're not going to use it at the coronation because it would be a little bit embarrassing for whoever was going to wear it, Camilla. But yeah, I mean, who owns things that were taken in the past? Quite important treasures. And also the concept of restorative justice, which is something that is really, I think, gaining traction, where victims of crime meet the perpetrators of the crime. And some really quite amazing stories about how that has quite significantly changed people. That's the sort of introduction. Do you have any thoughts about what this particular topic and why it's important this to look at and think about? You're on mute, Harry. No,
well, hello. I mean, if we're talking about today's topic, the fallout of war and repairing countries after the fallout of war is quite important, and perhaps occasionally a little overlooked in the history books as well. If we're talking about that sort of issue, I don't know if you have anything to.
Well, I do. I mean, I think because I was just talking downstairs with someone about. She said she was doing some stuff, reading some stuff about what had happened in Italy during the Second World War, and I was saying how many films from that immediately post-war era, British films and Italian films, they show a country that's really quite scarred by battle. And you look at pictures of Syria, now, my goodness, I mean, how did they begin to restore that? Yeah, I mean, I was, in Liberia just after the Civil War, and these people were living in these bombed out buildings, where all that was left, these blocks of flats. All that was left was the concrete frame, and everything else had been burnt and destroyed, but people were living in there. I mean, child soldiers drugged up to the eyeballs, sitting on the street corners. I mean, it was just quite devastating. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. How do you restore? How do you put something back? Of course, you can't put it back. You've got to put something new in its place. So what we go on. What I want to look at today is some little bits from the Old Testament, which will indicate a sort of an underlying principle in the Old Testament of restitution, and then look at one particular story in some depth from the New Testament, the story of Zacchaeus in Luke's Gospel, and we'll look at that in depth. Let's just have a look at some passages. Can you see this? Yep. You can see it, yeah. Where should we go to? I mean, I think it's worth reading it. I mean, it's just you can read until you're bored. Well, read probably down to about verse 15. Are you okay for it, Harley? I mean, this is
down to about verse
15, which is sort of
right
there, yeah. I mean, this is part of the law of Moses from the book of Exodus. These are the kind of rules that are being set, and a part of the Torah, and they're everyday rules. They're not kind of big, great philosophical statements. They're just laws, really, just laws, ancient laws. Okay.
So where do you want me to read from?
From the beginning of the chapter through to about verse 15.
Oh, right.
So
sorry, I cut you off. Sorry. What were you about to say?
Well, they're not the most edifying of readings, but it'll give you the concept.
No. Right. They're absolutely not. No. Anyway, it's been a long time since I've read the laws of Moses. Anyway, I shall read. When someone steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, the thief shall pay 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. The thief shall make restitution, but if unable to do so, shall be sold for the theft. When the animal, either ox or donkey or sheep, is found alive in the thief's possession, the thief shall pay double. If a thief is found breaking in and is beaten to death, no blood guilt is incurred. But if it happens after sunrise, blood guilt is incurred. When someone causes a field or vineyard to be grazed over, or lets livestock loose to graze in someone else's field, restitution shall be made from the best in the owner's field or vineyard. When fire breaks out and catches in thorns, so that the stacked grain or the standing grain or the field is consumed, the one who started the fire shall make full restitution. When someone delivers to a neighbor money or goods for safekeeping, and they are stolen from the neighbor's house, the thief, if caught, shall pay double. If the thief is not caught, the owner of the house shall be brought before God to determine whether or not the owner had laid hands on the neighbor's goods. In any case of disputed ownership involving ox, donkey, sheep, clothing, or any other loss of which one party says, "This is mine," the case of both parties shall come before God. The one whom God condemns shall pay double to the other. when someone delivers to another a donkey, ox, sheep, or any other animal for safekeeping, and it dies or is injured or is carried off without anyone seeing, an oath before the Lord shall decide between the two of them that the one has not laid hands on the property of the other. The owner shall accept the oath, and no restitution shall be made. But if it was stolen, restitution shall be made to its owner. If it was mangled by beasts, let it be brought as evidence. Restitution shall not be made for the mangled remains. When someone borrows an animal from another and it is injured or dies, the owner is not being present. Full restitution shall be made. If the owner was present, there shall be no restitution. If it was hired, only the hiring fee is due. How long should I go on for?
No, that's enough. That's plenty. No,
right.
That's plenty.
Okay.
We've got the idea.
Yes, we do. Yes.
But it is interesting, isn't it? I mean, these are, I mean, how we would deal with situation of somebody's, you know, somebody stealing an ox or something like that. I mean, they would go to court, have a fine, or sent to prison. Whereas within the system here that's expounded here is it has to be put right. You know, you have to pay back. You give. And I actually would prefer that if somebody stole something from me. I mean, I'd rather have it back than the person, you know, sent to prison.
It's actually this is I quite like this. I mean, I always I have this bad memory about these sort of bad memories about the laws of Moses being awful and draconian, but these are actually quite lenient in a way compared to what we do now to thieves. Surprisingly, but, you know, that's just my first impression, to be honest.
I know, and I think in a clan culture as well. I know this is true of Somalis. You know, if someone is wronged, then there are. It's like this. There are kind of quantities. I mean, 100 camels for, you know, somebody gets killed or something. I don't know. I mean, just make it up. But it's the clan that makes restitution to the other clan. You know, as opposed to it all being about individual. It's seen as a kind of against the clan. And I think I do think it's interesting, actually.
Very.
Hi, Neil. To introduce you to Rajan, who's on my screen is above you, but
Rajan.
We're looking at the concept of restitution and what's the other word? Restitution and restoration. So we just started by looking at something from Leviticus, from Exodus rather, and it was just showing how just for basic things like theft and so on, and accident and damage to properties, those kind of issues when they arise, that the response, the law required that those things be put right, that people pay back to cover the damage. And I think, although these were quite practical things that we were looking at, I think underlying it is a concept, it's a principle that you pay back for what you have done, rather than, you know, just be draconianly thrown into prison, which is what we do in our kind of society. Just a little bit more on the same kind of theme, but slightly different, from Leviticus. You want to read this?
Jump in again. Yeah,
just
sure.
jump in, yeah.
Leviticus. Yeah. Offerings of restitution. Restitution is it feels like a biblical idea that is not being explored enough. Actually,
you're right.
It's so kind of. I mean, you're just proving to me that it's so kind of prevalent. You know, it's not just a sort of minor thing. Actually, it's a huge thing in the Old Testament, it seems. So,
Yeah.
and with that being said, let's jump in. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "When any of you commit a trespass and sin unintentionally in any of the holy things of the Lord, you shall bring, as your guilt offering to the Lord, a ram without blemish from the flock, convertible into silver by the sanctuary shekel. It is a guilt offering, and you shall make restitution for the holy thing in which you were remiss, and shall add 1/5 to it and give it to the priest. The priest shall make atonement on your behalf with the ram of the guilt offering, and you shall be forgiven. If any of you sin without knowing it, doing any of the things that by the Lord's commandment ought not to be done, you have incurred guilt and are subject to punishment. You shall bring the priest a lamb without blemish from the flock, or the equivalent, as a guilt offering. And the priest shall make atonement on your behalf for the error that you committed unintentionally, and you shall be forgiven. It is a guilt offering. You have incurred guilt before the Lord."
Okay, and this is dealing with a different category of things. This isn't about practical things like that. This is about offences against the cult, against the religion, religious practice. But the same principle applies. That you make restitution, this time through sacrifices, and particularly verse 16, you shall make restitution for the holy thing which you miss, and you shall add 1/5 of it and give it to the priests. Lucky priest, eh? So do you see the idea that you move, if you offend against the holy things of the Lord, that would be against any of the sort of religious practices, then you are also to make restitution to God.
Kind of a sense that in both situations you are seen as making an offense against a being, if you can call God a being.
Yeah.
But do you think? Yeah. I mean, the living God has been offended.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the question is whether or not one works up to the other. So you have the concept of restitution in ordinary day-to-day practice, but you also have it in your religious practice as well. And so does one lead to the other, or the other lead to the one? Does the religious practice actually lead to practical things? And I mean, we don't need to dwell on this because of the time, but go on, carry on.
Yeah, sure. No, don't worry. Forget it.
No, say it. Whatever it was.
I think I was just going to say something like what binds and what separates the kind of religious from the just practical day-to-day stuff as well, I suppose, is quite interesting there, because you've kind of got this sense that you pay for things in the same way between both, but there's certainly ways in which they're bound and ways in which they're not, I guess, is what I'm saying. But...
yeah, I don't quite know the answer to that, because I don't think there would have been that understanding of a separation between, it would be part of the culture.
No.
So things like, cleanliness, purification might be regarded as holy things. Whereas, I mean, things like theft and so on, I mean, but they're all part and parcel of the cultural practice. Not as we have it here in our society, where it's quite distinct separation between what we do as a religious practice versus what we do as an everyday practice in our society.
you can keep going. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of as you said, you know, what kind of follows the other? Does God follow on from the cultural practices and the law, or or is it the other way around? Yeah.
I mean, I'm just not going to. We don't need to read this, but just remind you that, you know, in Leviticus 25 as well, you get this concept of the year of Jubilee, which is more about restoration. You know, that they say you shall count off 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, so that this period of 7 weeks of years gives 49 years. Then you shall have the trumpet sounded loud, and on the 10th day of the 7th month of the day, you shall have the trumpet sounded loud, and you shall hallow the 50th year. You shall proclaim liberty throughout the land for all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee to you. You shall return every one of you, to your property, and every one of your family. That 50 years shall be a jubilee for you. You shall not sow or reap or have to go to harvest the jubilee. And then I mean, the basic idea is that anybody who's lent anything, you know, you have to pay it back, and everybody starts again at the year of Jubilee, and that's a really key concept throughout the whole of the Bible, but it's a key concept for I think our thoughts today about restoration, and that Jubilee means you put things right, and that becomes really quite important in the New Testament, where I am now going to go. Luke 19, 1:10. Yeah, there it is. So do you like to read that one, and then I think we'll have a look at this one in some depth, and think about how this story might tell us something about this concept of restoration.
Shall I read it?
Yeah, please.
He entered Jericho and was passing through it. A man was there named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. He was trying to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd he could not, because he was short in stature. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him, because he was going to pass that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today. So he hurried down and was happy to welcome him. All who saw it began to grumble and said, he's gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner. Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, look, half of my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much. Then Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, because he too is the son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek out and to save the lost.
I think the one thing to kind of note is that its location in the gospel story is chapter 19, and a bit later on in chapter 19 we have the story of Jesus entering Jerusalem on Good Friday, so that it's just prior to the story of the last week of Jesus' life, crucifixion, and then the resurrection. And so it's got, I want us to start to see how this is not just a single little story, a little vignette in the gospel, but that it actually is telling something about the whole of the gospel. The gospel story is reaching a bit of a climax. So some of the big themes of the gospel come into this passage. Just go back to Luke chapter 8, and you see 18 rather, and you see the stories that precede it. the story of the widow and the unjust judge, the parable of the Pharisees and the tax collector. Remember that Zacchaeus is a tax collector. And the last line there is, I tell you this, but all exalt themselves will be humble, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. Story of the little children, a little person, little people. Story of the rich ruler, and Jesus foretells his death, and then this story of the healing of the blind man, and he says, your faith has saved you. If you look, just go back a little bit to verse 8. I tell you, he will quickly grant justice to them. And yet when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? So Jesus is asking this question, will he find faith on earth? And what follows is, well, will we find faith on earth? Is it going to happen? So you see these things leading up to the story. And then let's look at it. Well, we've already mentioned the importance of the location of the story in Luke. So the very first line, he entered Jericho and was passing through it. So we know why he's passing through Jericho. He's passing through Jericho on his way to Jerusalem, which is the opposite way of the story of the Good Samaritan. Luke is so clever. He interweaves, so many themes so cleverly. Anyway, I noticed that. A man was there named Zacchaeus. Okay, he's New Revised Standard Version translated as he was a chief tax collector. Often called publicans in translation. If you remember, we've seen tax collectors before in the Gospel. There's a few stories about publicans, tax collectors leading up to the story. But there's one big difference here. Can you see the difference between this tax collector and the other tax collector? I mean, it's dead simple. It's chief tax collector. So you've got, you've got a number of stories of tax collectors in the Gospel, but the last one, the last tax collector to appear, is the chief one, and he's rich. And what can you think of other things in the Gospel that when Jesus talks about wealth and money, what's Jesus' view of wealth?
But it gets in the way.
It gets in the way, warns against avarice, stories about wealth and money, Lazarus, the rich man and Dives and Lazarus, the rich man and Lazarus, is only in Luke's Gospel. Can you remember what in the Sermon on the Mount or the Sermon on the Plain Jesus says about rich people? He says they are cursed today because they have their reward. They are cursed because they have their reward today. Woe to those who are...
But instead store up your treasures in heaven, right?
Yeah, all there.
Or store for yourself up treasures in heaven, yeah.
So, and then slightly after this, there's another story, the story of the widow
Mm,
in the temple,
mm,
who gives her mite, her small amount of money, which is, deemed as being more valuable than any other gift that's been given, because she's given all she had. And that's another story that kind of anticipates the crucifixion. Jesus gave all he had. The widow gave all he had. Okay. So he was trying to see who Jesus was. Just pulling out words, trying to see.
Not trying, well, trying to understand, trying to discern. I mean, it's the same stuff about why Jesus always heals sight. Well, why Jesus heals sight so much in the Bible.
Yes,
as well, isn't it?
That's absolutely true.
Yeah.
But who else? Can you think of who else tried to see Jesus and to know who he was and know about it?
It's going to be really obvious, isn't it?
But it's not so obvious, actually. Sorry, I feel like I'm doing a Bible quiz, but I think this is this passage really is so dense when you actually start to unpack it.
Do you think of Mary Magdalene?
No, I'm thinking of Herod. Do you remember?
Oh, right.
Yeah, Herod, the fox. Remember, he came to seek out Jesus, that he wanted to know miracles, and then Jesus was warned, that this Herod had bad intention. So there's a contrast here between the Herod who had the bad intention of coming to see Jesus and whatever motivation Zacchaeus has. But Herod didn't get to see Jesus, but until later. But Zacchaeus does. What about who Jesus was? Well, you can think of other people in the gospel who have been able to identify who Jesus was. Simeon in the temple. In the story of John the Baptist, it begins with John quotes Isaiah and says, "All mankind shall see the salvation of our God." So this identification of who Jesus was is an important theme in the gospel. But on account of the crowd, he could not, because he was short in stature. And you want to say, well, why does Luke bother to talk about Zacchaeus' height? Is it a little detail, or is he alerting us back into part of the story? I already gave you a clue to that one. Well, he blesses the children, the little children, and he says, Jesus says, "Don't worry about what you eat, etc., etc. Whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. For the least of all of you is the greatest." So just the shortness of stature, the kind of silliness of the man, actually is a metaphor for the acceptance of Jesus. And when Jesus came to the place, where are we going? He ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him, because he was going to pass that way. Up there as well. But when Jesus came to the place, he looked and said, "Zacchaeus, hurry, come down. But I must stay at your house today. I must stay." I mean, it isn't that he hadn't got anywhere fixed for the night. It isn't that Jesus just hadn't bothered to book into the hotel when he was passing by. the I must stay is another characteristic in the gospel. In the temple, when Jesus as a child goes to the temple, he said, "I must be about my Father's business." You know, in Luke chapter 4, I must go and preach in other cities after Nazareth, and in the predictions to the Passion, I must suffer, I must die. So there's a sense in which that whatever's going on here with Zacchaeus, going to Zacchaeus' house is part of the plan. It's a fulfillment of the whole thing. I must stay in your house today. When you think of times when the word today has significance.
He talks about the kingdom of God coming, doesn't he? And doesn't he often say today, or it's here now?
Yeah, absolutely. And right at the very beginning, today, in Bethlehem's town, yeah, I mean,
Savior is
to
born.
the shepherds, a Savior is born, yeah. So today, and on the cross, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. That's in Luke. So the today is the kind of this sense in which, you know, the kingdom is here, and it's here now, and it's here in this happening. What is going on here? So he hurried down and was happy to welcome him, to receive, and all who saw it began to grumble and said, "He has got to be the guest of one who is a sinner." Zacchaeus stood there. So, I mean, it's not clear whether they're still under the tree or at his house, but it looks as if they must be in Zacchaeus' house by now, because the people are criticizing and saying they're a sinner. Zacchaeus makes a proclamation. "Look, half of my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anything of anyone, I will pay back 4 times as much." So we get into the rub now of how this is about restitution and restoration. What do you think about that? I mean, any things that pull out for you there? He stood there, so look.
Lots of things, really. I mean, there's no suggestion that he's actually done anything wrong in his job. It's merely the fact that he does the job he has is a problem. So he's not necessarily, he says, if I have defrauded anyone of anything. I mean, that's, you know, maybe I'm being a bit disingenuous, because that does suggest he thinks he might have done, but you know, it's not absolute there. And also, Jesus then doesn't tell him to stop being a tax collector to have salvation. He doesn't have to stop being that. He can, in a sense, carry on, but it's the way in which he does it that seems to be the problem. And his attitude towards, you know, the fact he's rich, I suppose, means at the very least he's being paid well by the occupiers. So the oppressors, so he's part of that group, but he's not necessarily bending the rules for himself. And I think that's quite important, that, you know, sometimes, you know, people can say, I was just doing my job. Yeah, well, the job's a problem.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the word defrauded that's translated there is also often translated as oppress. So
yes.
Same way in Proverbs, you get things like a ruler who oppresses the poor is a beating rain that leaves no food. You know, I mean, it's defrauding is a bit
it's
more
oppression.
than
No, I get that, but I mean, he could simply have oppressed them simply by just being a tax collector, couldn't he? I mean, the whole system might be wrong, but Jesus doesn't actually criticize the system.
No.
And he doesn't say that's got to stop or you've got to stop. And what struck me is its contrast with the rich young ruler, who he basically It says has to give everything away.
Mm, mm. I mean, I will pay back. Give half of my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah.
And I will pay back 4 times as much.
Yeah.
Do you remember when we looked at the
Mm.
passage from Leviticus?
Mm.
It was how much had to be given to the priest.
The Exodus one, wasn't
And
it?
the Exodus, yeah.
I think one of them literally says, you know, you give that 4 times as many lambs, is it?
That's right, yes.
Yeah.
It does. But also there are some, the other one, the Leviticus one said you give 1/5 to the priest. So he's giving a bit more. But there's another story where 4 comes in, which is interesting. Do you remember the story of David and Nathan and David says to Nathan, as the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die. He should restore the lamb 4-fold because he did this thing and because he had no pity.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a sense in which that 4-fold has got some significance there.
What we're not actually talking about is why Zacchaeus does this.
Mm.
What is it that makes him do it? Jesus has just gone to his house.
Mm. And the question is whether it's because he just happens to get caught up in the story of redemption. You know, it was just whatever, or
and maybe it could be just be a reputation thing. Look, he's gone to the house of a sinner. You know, I'll pay back as much. You know.
Well, he's given status in a way that he's not had before, isn't he? He's not judged and said, "Oh, you're a terrible man, therefore you've got to do it." So Jesus says, "I'll go to your house," which I think in their culture would have been a sign of real honor, wouldn't it? To do that, he is the most honored person in the village. It's the Queen coming to your house, or whoever it might be. Nick Cave turning up at the door. It's therefore you are the most honored person in the village. Therefore, that I guess is the motivation, and that's it. But he's already open, isn't he? Because he's trying to see who Jesus is. So he's already looking.
Yeah, exactly. If you go on to verse 9, then Jesus said to him, "Today salvation," again today. Okay?
Yeah.
"Today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham." I mean, salvation.
Covenant thing of it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That's a bit obvious. But...
No, it's absolutely right. I mean,
and I am here. You know, I am here, and you know, you're still within my covenant, and this isn't. You know,
And right in the early days of early part of the gospel, you know, in the story, you know, John, Zechariah's prayer in the Benedictus, you know, Jesus, the Messiah is called the horn of salvation. Knowledge of salvation to his people for the forgiveness of their sins. You know, that word salvation comes all the time. So right at the very beginning, that's a message about the purpose of the gospel. The purpose of the gospel is it's about bringing salvation. But I think what's really interesting there is salvation is he too is a son of Abraham. So if you're talking about restoration and restitution, Zacchaeus does the restitution by paying back and honoring his debts and giving to the poor. Jesus does the restoration. You know, in return for that, you know, he's restored as the son of Abraham. Does that make sense? Yeah. And then this purpose, the Son of Man came to seek out. So just as Zacchaeus was seeking out, Jesus is seeking out and saving the lost. And there's this, what Zacchaeus is doing, Jesus is doing. well. Then they come together and they meet each other in the middle, and there is this restoration of the people of Israel. So these people who are marginalized outside become part of the whole again.
Mm. I mean, yeah, I mean, there's a sort of sense in which, yeah, I mean, the restitution thing is quite obvious here, I mean, but there is this kind of sense in which, after that, Jesus kind of reaffirms, look, he is a son of Abraham. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Abraham is mentioned quite a lot in Luke. I mean, in the early part, in Mary's song and in Zechariah's song, and this is about that. But there's one other thing which really interests me about this story is in Luke chapter 4, you remember Jesus is in Nazareth and he takes the scroll and he reads from Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He's anointed me to bring good news to the poor, to release the captives, recovery sight to the blind, the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And you can sort of trace that through. The story of Jesus' ministry is mapped out in that quote from Isaiah in what is often called the manifesto, Jesus' manifesto in Nazareth. But the last one of them, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, is actually referring to the Jubilee, to proclaim the Jubilee. And this is the last, this is just before we move into the Passion story, that this is, you would say this is about an indicator of Jesus bringing about the Jubilee. This is what it's about. It's about this paying back, settling debts, restoring, putting things right. And that's actually what Zacchaeus ends up chooses to do. So what Jesus has done here is symbolically, metaphorically shown that this is the Jubilee now that's going to happen. And then it follows followed by this messianic triumphal ride. Not triumphal, I don't think it's the wrong word actually. Though it's usually called the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. This confrontation. What do you think? Are we barking at the wrong tree, or does this make sense?
Well, it makes sense. What I like about it are the gaps in the story. In the you don't actually know for sure why Zacchaeus does what he does, and I think that's really helpful because it leaves it open for us then to think, well, why would we?
Yeah,
we're not given a prescriptive thing. I like that gap, and I like the gap too that Jesus accepts what he's done and doesn't ask any more of him than that. But he could have done, and he has asked more of other people. So what's different here? Reminds me a little bit of, is it the parable of the vineyard workers, where different people start at different points of the day, but they all get paid the same at the end.
That's right.
Those who start at the beginning grumble about it. But it's not for us to determine what God's kingdom requires of us.
No, that's absolutely right. No, I do feel it is a kind of pivotal story, and it's only in Luke as well. So I think he's clearly using it to bring together the kind of core themes of the gospel so far. The table fellowship, eating, conversion, salvation, the lost and found, the transformation of people, and then I think this idea of and I think something about connecting with the Old Testament. I think maybe this is why he's not asking. Well, he's not asking more, because actually the story is connecting into the Old Testament concepts of restitution. So Jesus is showing how things are put right, through the gospel. Things are put right through the ministry of Jesus. Things are put right, and that's what Jesus is there for. And to me, that's what we need in the world today. Putting things right, restitution, sorting things out, and in the end, they are practical. All of these things we've talked about are practical. You pay back. You pay your debts. The IMF, isn't good enough. I mean, the Guardian has to pay some money for slaves that they profited from. You can't duck these kind of hard, often economic questions that are really fundamentally moral questions.
Yeah. Well, the budget is a moral document, isn't
it? Totally. Or immoral.
Yes.
Maybe a more accurate description. Yeah.
Okay.